Before we begin, how are you feeling today? I hope you're okay and taking care of yourself. If today was a bad day, I'm glad you're here. Take a deep breath. This moment is yours. Ready? Let's begin. Rain changes the way we experience silence. It doesn't simply fall. It surrounds, presses in, seeps beneath doors and under skin. It makes the ordinary feel distant and the familiar feel foreign. In places already forgotten by the world, rain doesn't cleanse. It reveals. It lifts just enough of the surface to show what was buried, what was left behind, what never really left at all. That's what this series is about. These are stories not of haunted houses, but of haunted moments, of people who weren't looking for anything unnatural, but found themselves face to face with something they could neither explain nor forget. From the hills of Tennessee to the gas stations of Louisiana, from the alleys of New Orleans to the echoing tunnels beneath a school in San Francisco, each of these stories begins in the rain. And not because the weather was bad, because the veil was thin. Rain is a memory trigger, a threshold, a soft knocking on whatever separates our world from everything we pretend isn't still watching. The people in these stories aren't investigators. They're not thrill seekers. They were just passing through, carrying ordinary burdens. Heartbreak, exhaustion, loneliness, curiosity. And in that vulnerability, they stepped too close to something that noticed. Something old, something patient. Maybe you've been there too. Maybe you've heard footsteps on wet concrete when no one was behind you. Maybe you've seen headlights bend the wrong way in a storm. Maybe, just once, you felt the air change and couldn't say why. If you have, you're not alone. These 8 stories aren't meant to scare you. They're here to remind you that when it rains long enough, something always rises, and sometimes it remembers your name. And so we begin, where the sky is always gray and the rain rarely asks permission. In a city known for silence behind windows, one woman checked into a motel that should have been empty. But rain doesn't just dampen concrete in Seattle. It wakes up what lingers under bridges, behind walls, and inside rooms that remember. Story 1. He checked in, but never checked out. My name is Lauren. I'm 28 years old, and for the past few years I've worked as a freelance designer, which basically means I chase contracts, live out of my car half the time, and hope the Wi-Fi's decent wherever I end up. In early December of 2022, I drove to Seattle for a last-minute meeting with a potential client. Rain was coming down so hard the freeway looked like it was dissolving under my tires. The Airbnb I booked canceled on me mid-drive. Pipe burst, apparently. So I scrambled for anything nearby that wasn't $400 a night. That's how I found myself pulling into the Rainier View Motel, tucked under the shadow of the Aurora Bridge on Aurora Avenue North, just past the Fremont Troll. It looked like the kind of place where time stopped in the 80s and everything had since grown damp. The man at the front desk didn't even ask for ID. He slid the key across the scratch counter like he'd done it 1,000 times too many. Room 107, second to last on the left. As I stepped out into the cold, I noticed room 110 had its lights on. A warm, amber glow spilled through a gap in the curtains. The window was slightly fogged, like someone had been breathing against it. Something about the light felt oddly human, lived in, comforting in a way. But Dale, the man at the front, had told me I was the only check-in for the night. I let it go. I was exhausted, soaked, and starving. Inside, my room smelled faintly of mildew and something industrial trying to cover it up. The heating clanked like an old radiator with a grudge. Outside, the rain never paused. It was that thick Pacific Northwest kind of rain, the kind that feels like it knows secrets. I laid on the bed, scrolling through emails until a soft knock broke the hum of the heater. It wasn't at my door. I sat still, listening. 3 soft knocks again, from room 110. Then the faintest whisper, too soft to understand. I got up, peeked through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. Around 2:30 a.m., unable to sleep, I stepped out to get a soda from the vending machine. That's when I saw him, a little boy, maybe 10, barefoot and standing outside room 110. He looked at me without surprise, like he knew I'd come out. He asked in a calm, tired voice, "Do you hear the tapping too?" Then, without waiting for an answer, he turned and pushed the door open. It closed behind him silently, like it hadn't been locked. My heart beat faster, but I told myself it was just a family staying there. Maybe they forgot to check in. Maybe Dale didn't care. The next morning, I saw the boy again. He was sitting on the curb outside the front office, hoodie pulled tight, kicking gravel. I asked if he was okay. He said nothing at first, then nodded toward the rooms. She cries when it rains. She always does. Before I could ask what that meant, a woman appeared from around the corner, mid-30s, exhausted, carrying 2 coffees. "Benji," she said firmly. "Inside." She looked at me like I'd crossed a line. "He makes up stories when he doesn't sleep," she added. But her voice wavered at the end, like maybe she wasn't convinced either. I went back inside, packed my things. I had to check out by noon. Before I left, I asked Dale, jokingly, trying to seem casual, what the deal was with room 110. He didn't laugh. He didn't even look up. "There is no room 110, he said. "That's a storage closet." I thought he was being sarcastic, but then he pulled out the motel's registry book. Room 109, then room 111. No 110. No one named Benji. No guests. I told him I saw the kid go inside. He set his pen down, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Don't talk to him again." I walked back outside, unsettled. I passed room 110 again. The door was still there. The numbers were still there. The amber light still glowed from within. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Even after I checked in a nicer hotel in downtown Seattle, even after dinner with my client, even after a hot shower, I kept thinking about the way the boy had spoken, the way the woman looked at me, like she wanted to say something but couldn't. The way Dale's eyes dropped when I asked questions. Curiosity's a dangerous thing, especially when paired with a gut feeling. I returned to the Rainier View Motel the next night, parked across the street. Rain was back again, harder this time, cold like it meant something. The amber light was still on. I sat in my car and waited. At 3:12 a.m., I saw movement. The door opened slightly. A hand, small, pale, rested on the edge. Then a shadow moved behind it. I couldn't see clearly through the rain, but something about the way that hand disappeared, slow, reluctant, unsettled me in a way I can't explain. The next day, I went back and asked Dale one more time. He told me what I think he hadn't told anyone in years, that room 110 used to exist. That in 2003, a man named Walter checked in with his son, stayed 3 days. On the 3rd night, during a storm just like this, Walter drowned his son in the bathtub, then slit his own wrists. Room 110 was sealed, renumbered, forgotten. But grief, Dale said, has a way of refusing to die. It just moves in quietly and waits. I never saw Benji again. But sometimes when it rains in whatever town I'm working in next, I think I hear tapping through the walls. Soft, deliberate, waiting. Like some part of that room followed me out. Or maybe just the memory of a boy who wanted someone, anyone, to listen. And maybe that's the cruelest part. We always think we're just passing through. But some places, Some places, they remember. If you've ever stayed somewhere that didn't feel quite right, even if nothing looked wrong, maybe listen to that feeling next time. Maybe that's your one chance to leave before something decides you belong there too. And if you've ever heard tapping during a storm and weren't sure if it was just the wind, then you know why stories like this matter. Why they're worth telling. Why we need to remember what others tried to forget. You're not alone in that feeling. Not anymore. And if you want to keep walking with us, beyond the veil of what seems ordinary, you know what to do. What stays behind in a motel may be memory, but what lies beneath a gas station, that's something deeper. Something buried not just under time, but under cement, secrecy, and shame. As the storm moved south, so did the quiet. And what waited on the edge of a crumbling road in Baton Rouge had been waiting far too long. Story 2. He said the dead don't like rain. My name is Darius, and I was 34 when the ground opened beneath my feet and nearly took me with it. I've worked as a civil engineer for over a decade, mostly in New Orleans, but I was born in Natchez, Mississippi, and every few months I make the drive back home to visit my mother. That stretch of highway between New Orleans and Natchez is long and familiar, winding past empty fields, rusting gas stations, and small churches half swallowed by oak trees. I never thought it would be a gas station that reminded me why some places are better left off the map. It was late April, and the kind of thunderstorm that makes everything feel swollen and electric had been chasing me up Highway 61 since dawn. The sky was the color of wet cement, and the rain wasn't falling. It was pouring sideways, the kind that makes your windshield wipers useless and your hands grip the wheel tighter than necessary. About 30 minutes outside of Baton Rouge, a tire pressure warning blinked on. I pulled off at the first gas station I saw, a crumbling old stop with a rusted canopy and a flickering sign that simply said gas in faded red letters. The kind of place you'd think had been abandoned years ago, but the lights were still on and the pump still worked, barely. The lot was empty except for a white van with one flat tire and a shopping cart pushed up against the side of the building. I parked near the air machine, got out, and immediately felt the slickness of the concrete under my boots. The rain had softened everything, and the ground didn't feel solid. It had that strange give, like wet sponge beneath a crust of pavement. I didn't think much of it at first. Louisiana soil is a living thing, shifting, swelling, and cracking under pressure. It's what I do for a living after all. I've assessed entire subdivisions built on unstable foundations, but something about this ground felt wrong. While waiting for the air compressor to start, I walked toward the restroom around back. It was the kind you have to ask for a key for, but the door was already ajar. Inside, the air was thick and warm, and the smell of mold clung to the walls. The light buzzed overhead, barely illuminating the floor. That's when I noticed the footprints. Barefoot, small, too small for an adult. They were wet, as if someone had just walked through. But the rain outside was cold, and there was no puddle near the door. The prints led toward the far wall and stopped abruptly, as if the person had simply vanished into it. My stomach tightened, and for a moment I just stood there, listening. I thought I heard something faint beneath the floor, like tapping or whispering. But then again, the rain was hitting the roof so hard it could have been anything. As I stepped back out, an old man was standing a few feet away, hunched under a poncho made from a trash bag, holding an umbrella with half its spokes broken. He stared at the ground as he spoke, never once meeting my eyes. "You feel it too, huh?" he said, his voice gritty with phlegm and age. "The ground don't like to be stepped on when it's raining. It remembers." I nodded politely, thinking he was just another lost soul trying to make conversation, but he kept talking. "They built this place on top of graves. Didn't move 'em proper, just paved over. Told folks it was clean dirt. That was a lie. I should have walked away, but something in his tone held me there. Not desperation, resignation, like someone who'd accepted a truth long ago and stopped trying to explain it. He told me his name was Clarence, and he used to work construction, back when they expanded the lot in the late 80s. Said they found caskets when they dug the back septic line. Tiny ones, children, but they covered it up, buried the evidence. He said the rain always brings them back. That's why the ground softens, he muttered. It's breathing. I didn't believe him, not really, but something about that cracked pavement and those footprints stuck with me. I walked around the building once more. At the edge of the lot, near where a drainage ditch had overflowed, the asphalt had cracked wide open. Not a pothole, an actual cavity, like the earth had yawned mid-sentence. I leaned over carefully. Beneath the surface, I saw wood. Not pipes, not concrete. Rotting wood, box edges, like coffins. The smell rising from the fissure was not mud or sewage. It was sweet, pungent decay. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I forgot how to move. The next few minutes blurred. I remember yelling for Clarence, but he was gone. I ran back to my car, but the rear wheels had sunk slightly into the broken section of the lot. My engine revved uselessly. The front tires spun against gravel and slime. The more I tried to push forward, the deeper the car seemed to sink. I jumped out again and the rain hit me like it was angry. I slipped, slammed my hands against the car, and then I heard it, under the sound of the storm, a voice. No louder than a whisper, but it was there. Don't leave, it said. They never said goodbye. I froze. My hands trembled, not from cold, but from something deeper. A kind of grief that didn't belong to me, but passed through me like static. I realized then that Clarence hadn't been crazy. He was the only one who stayed long enough to remember the truth. The people buried beneath this place weren't honored. They weren't mourned. They were erased. And when that happens, they don't rest. They wait. Eventually, I managed to reverse the car, jerking it free from the edge of collapse. Mud sprayed across my windows, and the tires screamed, but I got out. I didn't stop driving until I saw the city skyline. I didn't speak about it to anyone, not even my mother, because some things, when spoken aloud, feel too heavy to carry. But I remembered the feeling, the way the rain felt like judgment, the way the pavement shifted like it didn't want me there. And I wonder, how many places do we walk over without knowing who lies beneath? If you ever stop at a gas station that feels forgotten, whose lights flicker too rhythmically, whose silence stretches too long, remember, not everything buried stays buried, and not all voices whisper from above. Some echo from the ground. And if this story made you feel the weight of what's often paved over and ignored, then you understand why we shared them. Why we return to places people forget and listen for what still lingers. You're not alone out there. And if you're still here with me, maybe it's time to subscribe. Not for horror, but for memory. For what the earth still remembers when we choose to listen. Sometimes the dead speak upward from the ground. Other times, the silence comes from the trees. There are places in the mountains where the air doesn't move unless it's watching. Where solitude doesn't mean safety. Our next story begins not with a scream, but with a knock. And a cabin that listened harder than it should have. Story 3. Something in the cabin knocked at 3:03 a.m. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 hours when the gravel road turned to mud, and the GPS pin told her she had arrived. Katie cut the engine and sat in her car, windshield wipers clicking in vain against the torrent. The forest pressed in from all sides, dark with pine and soaked with silence. The cabin was barely visible through the curtain of rain, 2 narrow windows, a crooked porch, and a brass number plate that looked rusted over. It wasn't the retreat she had pictured, but at that point, turning back felt like a greater burden than walking forward. It was supposed to be a weekend to reset. After the breakup, after the constant noise of Atlanta, after the sense that her life had become someone else's, Katie needed stillness. She had found the listing for the cabin on a second-tier rental site that promised a true mountain detox, complete with solitude, no Wi-Fi, and no distractions. That's what she had thought she wanted. But standing under the dripping edge of the porch, key in hand, something about the way the door gave way too easily made her stomach tighten. The inside smelled of old pine and something sweeter, like overripe fruit. Dust hung in the corners. A single oil lamp flickered on a small table by the window. The light switch didn't work, but the lamp glowed as if it had been lit just moments before. She called out, a habit more than anything, and waited for the silence to acknowledge her. It didn't. Outside, the rain continued like a steady breath pressed against the roof. Katie unpacked slowly. A duffel bag, a yoga mat, a journal she hadn't touched in months. She moved through the space methodically. Kitchenette, bathroom, bedroom, and locked the front door, even though she didn't think anyone would come this far out into the mountains. That night, she tried to sleep. The mattress was stiff, the air cold despite the heavy wool blanket. At 3:03 a.m., a noise pulled her halfway out of sleep. It was faint but distinct. 3 knocks. Not at the door. From the far wall behind her bed. Not aggressive but intentional. Like someone reminding her they were there. She sat up, heart pounding, and stared into the dark. Nothing moved. No wind, no creak, no second knock. The forest outside was silent. The kind of silence that feels filled with something just out of sight. She stayed awake until dawn, the sound of her breath the only rhythm she trusted. The next day, under an umbrella that did little against the mist, she wandered down the slope behind the cabin and found an old footpath. About half a mile down, she saw smoke rising from a chimney. The small house looked like it belonged there. Wooden, weather-worn, but alive. An older woman stood on the porch, wrapping a shawl tighter around her shoulders, as if she had been expecting Katie. Her name was Willow. Katie apologized for intruding, said she was staying in the cabin up the road. Willow's expression changed. Not surprise, recognition. "You shouldn't be alone up there when it rains," she said simply. "That cabin was never good for silence. It listens too closely." Katie laughed nervously, unsure if the woman was teasing her. But Willow didn't smile. She offered tea, but Katie declined, something in her gut tightening again. Back at the cabin, Katie found her journal open on the bed, though she was certain she had left it zipped in her bag. The page was blank, except for one line scribbled across the center. It never left. She stared at it for a long time, trying to recall if she had written it and forgotten. She checked her phone, still no service. The sky darkened prematurely as storm clouds rolled back in. That night, the knocks came again. Same time, same pattern, but this time they were followed by a soft scraping, like nails on wood. She pressed her ear to the wall. Nothing. Then the lamp flickered once, twice, then went out. Katie didn't sleep. The next morning, she searched the cabin top to bottom. Beneath a loose floorboard in the bedroom, she found a cavity stuffed with folded paper. Dozens of notes, yellowed with age, all handwritten. Some were only a few words. "It's under me. It knows I'm scared." Others were longer, fragmented journal entries that dissolved into scratched out lines and smeared ink. One in particular chilled her. I thought silence would save me. But silence only gave it room to speak. She took the notes to Willow. The older woman didn't seem surprised. She explained that the cabin had belonged to her family long ago. Her brother Thomas had stayed there the summer before he disappeared. He claimed he heard whispers at night, saw someone standing outside the windows even though no tracks were ever found in the mud. Their parents dismissed it. One morning, he was gone. The door was locked from the inside. Only a sheet of paper was left on his bed. Willow never showed it to anyone. Until now. She gave it to Katie. A single sentence. I tried to sleep. Katie didn't return to the cabin that night. She booked a motel in town, waited out the storm. When she came back the next morning to collect her things, the cabin was dark. The lamp had burned out, the blanket was folded, and her journal, the one she had tried to use, was gone. People come to the mountains to forget, to escape, to be quiet. But there's a difference between peace and silence. Peace lets you breathe. Silence listens for your breath, and then it waits. That cabin had waited a long time for someone to hear it again. Not everything that feels still is safe, and not everything that watches you wants to be seen. If you ever find yourself craving silence, ask yourself why. Ask yourself what you're hoping not to hear. And if you find a place that promises solitude too easily, that makes the world feel just a little too far away, pay attention to what breaks the quiet at night. Because if it knocks 3 times, it may just be asking to come in. And if this story reminds you of a time when silence felt heavy instead of healing, you're not alone. There are places that remember, and stories that never stopped whispering. You've heard one now. If you want to hear more, follow us. We're not here to scare you. We're here to tell the truth that still lingers between the rain and the wood. Where things wait quietly to be remembered. Silence in the forest has one voice, but silence in the city has many. In New Orleans, where music lingers even after the clubs close, something else lingers too. It stands in corners. It waits by coolers. And when the rain hits Canal Street just right, not all customers are alive, and not all disappearances are noticed. Story 4. He stood in the corner. Every time it rained. The rain started just as the streetcar disappeared into the distance, leaving behind the low hum of Canal Street and the rustling silence of after-hours New Orleans. The neon signs glowed more fiercely in the downpour, bleeding color across the wet sidewalk in streaks of pink and gold. Jalen ducked under the awning of a 24-hour corner store, shaking off his hoodie as thunder rolled somewhere above the tall hotels that boxed in the sky. He had missed the last ride home, but he wasn't surprised. The interview for his journalism project had run late, the audio recorder soaked in questions about night shift workers and forgotten storefronts. The city always gave him something more than he asked for. He just never expected it to give him this. Inside, the store was nearly empty. Rows of flickering fluorescents hummed overhead, and the tile floor reflected every movement like a shallow pool. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up, absorbed in a cracked laptop, the blue glow painting his face in hard lines. Jalen drifted between the aisles, pretending to browse, mostly just killing time. The storm outside had shifted from dramatic to oppressive, a kind of rain that made the walls feel thinner. He pulled out his phone to check the time and caught sight of a figure in the far corner of the store. A man stood motionless near the drink coolers. He was tall, soaked through, his back turned. His posture was unnatural, too still, as if the body had forgotten it was supposed to sway when standing. Jalen waited for him to move. reach for a bottle, check a label, shift his weight, but he never did. Just stood there, facing the glass. The fluorescent light above him buzzed louder than the rest. Something about that corner felt colder. Jalen turned toward the counter. The clerk, still absorbed in his screen, finally looked up when Jalen asked, "That guy over there, is he okay?" The man blinked. "What guy?" Jalen gestured toward the back corner. The clerk stood slowly, peered down the aisle, then frowned. "There's no one there." Jalen looked back. The space was empty. No wet footprints, no swinging door, just the hum of the cooler fans and the echo of something unspoken. The clerk shook his head and sat back down. "Must have been your reflection," he muttered, but his tone was too careful, too rehearsed. Jalen returned to the same spot the next night. Not because he was curious, at least that's what he told himself, but because he wanted to prove to himself that it had been a trick of the light. He needed it to be explainable. The storm returned like it had been waiting, heavier this time, slamming the pavement with a rhythm that felt familiar. The same clerk was there. Same silence. Same corners soaked in shadow. The figure was back. Same place. Same posture. This time, Jalen didn't look away. He stared for nearly a full minute until his throat dried and his legs ached. The man never moved. Not even the shallow rise and fall of breath. Jalen stepped forward, slowly, and then the lights above the cooler began to flicker. Once, then again. When he blinked, the figure was gone. That night, he didn't sleep. On the third night, the clerk finally spoke to him. Really spoke. He told Jalen his name was Troy, that he had worked that same shift for 8 years, and that every time it rained hard, people came in asking about someone who wasn't there. Always in the same spot, always with that same blank look. He told Jalen about a man who used to hang around the store back in 2017. Quiet guy, kept to himself. One night, during a hurricane warning, there was a commotion at the back of the store. The cameras went out. When they came back on, the man was gone. No one ever found him. No blood, no signs of a struggle, just a smear of water and one cooler door left slightly open. They never filed a report. Jalen asked why. Troy hesitated, because nobody wanted to explain why the footage keeps glitching. Why every year, around the same time during the first real storm of spring, he comes back. Jalen tried to laugh, but it didn't stick. The weight in his chest felt too real. He went home that night and pulled up news archives. Nothing. No missing person reports from that store. No articles. It was like the man never existed. But when he slowed down the video from his phone, footage he didn't remember taking, he saw something that made his skin tighten. One frame, less than a second long. The drink cooler door, ajar. A hand, pale and dripping, resting on the glass. He stopped going to the store after that, but the image didn't stop. Every time it rained, he saw it again. Reflected in subway windows, glass doors, puddles. That same figure, unmoving, standing in some corner of his vision. Watching without eyes. Waiting for something he didn't understand. Sometimes we go looking for stories, hoping to expose forgotten truths or uncover buried facts. But occasionally, the story finds us. And what it brings isn't something meant to be written down. It's something meant to be carried. Not all ghosts wear white or drag chains. Some just linger in places where justice never arrived. Where silence was the easiest way out. In New Orleans, the rain feels heavier than water. It's soaked in memory, in absence, in names no one says out loud anymore. And sometimes, if you walk down Canal Street just after midnight, you'll notice a certain store with flickering lights. You might step inside to avoid the storm. You might feel a coldness near the drink cooler, And if you do, whatever you do, don't look too long. Because the ones we forget don't always forgive. And if this story stays with you, if the next thunderstorm makes you glance twice at a reflection that doesn't move like yours, then you understand. This isn't just a story. It's a warning wrapped in neon and water and silence. There are places that remember, even when we pretend not to. If you're still here, listening, then walk with us. Follow. Not because it's scary, but because what haunts us most are the things no one bothered to see. Not all hauntings happen at night. Some wait beneath us, behind drywall, under old paint, and within places rented too cheaply in cities too expensive to care. Washington, D.C. holds its own ghosts, but they're quiet, and they only knock when you're alone and too tired to question the sound. Story 5. Don't stay past the third night. Moving to D.C. in the middle of July wasn't the plan, but that's how it played out. Eric had landed a tech contract that paid just enough to cover a cheap apartment and maybe a new mattress if he didn't eat out too often. He'd found a listing for a basement unit on a quiet block in Logan Circle, nestled among historic townhomes with iron railings and rose bushes poking through old brick. The listing described it as cozy, cool, and full of character. What they didn't mention was the dampness. From the moment he stepped inside, it felt like the air had been sitting still for years. The carpet was slightly tacky underfoot, and a faint smell, earthy, sweet, like old fruit, clung to the corners. Still, it was cheap, close to work, and had its own entrance. It was temporary. 3 months, maybe less. That's what he kept telling himself as he unpacked boxes alone in the faint light of a single table lamp. By the second day, the humidity began to make the walls sweat. The AC unit rattled like an old fan behind a locked door, and no matter how much Eric adjusted the settings, it only groaned in protest. That evening, a thunderstorm rolled in, fast and loud. Lightning strobed across the ceiling through the high, narrow windows. The power flickered once, then steadied, but something in the air shifted. He noticed water dripping from the corner of the living room wall, soaking into the trim near the floor. When he reached to inspect it, he noticed something beneath the paint. Raised lettering, like someone had scratched a message into the wall before it was covered. He peeled away a bit of the bubbled surface and made out the words, "Don't stay past the third night." He stared at it, waiting for logic to arrive. Maybe it was some tenant's joke, maybe a prank, but his chest felt tight, like something was pressing just behind his ribs. That night, he didn't sleep easily. At 2:47 a.m., he was jolted awake by a knock. Not on the door, but on the wall. 3 slow, hollow taps. He held still, heartbeat in his throat. Then silence. The next morning, he blamed it on pipes, or maybe the old foundation shifting with the storm. On the second night, the knock came again. Same time, a little louder. This time, he got up and pressed his ear to the wall. Nothing. But when he stepped away, the knocking returned. Once. Right where his ear had been. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't know who to tell. The city buzzed around him, indifferent, always moving, always too loud to notice the quiet things that live underground. It was the third night that broke something inside him. The air had grown heavier, like the basement was sinking under its own history. At 2:47, the knocks came, louder, faster, like fists now. Then a scraping sound, like nails dragging across drywall. He stood in the middle of the room, frozen, not even blinking. That's when the light flickered, and the AC cut out completely. In the silence that followed, he heard breathing. Slow, deliberate, but not his own. The next day, he knocked on the door upstairs. Mr. Rowe, the landlord, answered with cautious eyes and a voice that trembled on every third word. Eric asked if the unit had any issues: plumbing, heating, structural damage. Mr. Rowe didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "You've made it longer than the last guy. He left after 2 nights. Took nothing with him but his shoes." Eric laughed nervously, hoping it was sarcasm, but Mr. Rowe didn't smile. Before him, there was a woman. She painted all the vents shut, said something was watching her through them. I thought she was sick. Maybe she wasn't. That night, Eric found the vent behind his couch, painted over, sealed tight, but there was something behind it. Paper, folded many times. It was a journal page, dated August 2011. Most of the writing was smeared, but a few lines remained legible. "I can't sleep. It doesn't want sleep. It waits until I'm half dreaming, then it moves. Under the floor, in the walls, it lives in the spaces between." Eric stayed up until dawn, lights on, eyes red. He didn't hear knocking that night, but he also didn't blink for more than 5 seconds at a time. By morning, the decision was made. He packed everything he could carry and left the rest. As he stepped outside, the humidity wrapped around him like relief. The city, loud and careless, felt like safety again. He never filed a complaint, never posted a review. The deposit was never returned, but he didn't ask. Some places don't want to be noticed. They survive on forgetfulness. Not all haunted places have ghosts. Some are haunted by repetition, by whatever pain lived there first, repeating itself in whoever comes next. The real horror isn't the knocking, it's that we hear it, deny it, and stay anyway. If you ever find a place too quiet, too still, where the air presses down and the nights repeat themselves with precision, don't stay past the 3rd night. Listen to the walls. They remember more than you do. And if you've ever lived somewhere that made you feel watched, not by people, but by the house itself, you already know. There's a difference between a home and a trap. Stories like this aren't warnings for the weak. They're reminders for the unaware. And if you're still reading, still here, maybe you've heard something similar once. Maybe you felt the weight of silence turn into sound. Subscribe, if only to remind yourself you're not imagining it. You're just listening closely, maybe for the first time. What one person forgets, another inherits. A basement's memory gives way to a bar's reflection. And in Portland, where the rain doesn't fall, it settles. A voice that was locked away begins to find its way out. One whisper at a time, through mirrors, through walls, through the last stall no one dares to enter. Story 6, She Cries, in the last stall. Every time it rains, Portland never really dries. The rain doesn't fall as much as it lingers, thin, constant, just enough to soak into the brick and concrete until everything smells like damp rust and time. Zoe had been working the late shift at McAllister's for 5 months when she first heard it. The bar was tucked into a corner of the Pearl District, an old building that had once been a warehouse, then a bookstore, then something in between.
It had character, as the regulars like to say. Walls with peeling paint, mismatched stools, a jukebox that only played certain songs when it rained. Zoe didn't mind. The place was quiet enough, the pay steady, and the expectations low. The restroom sat down a narrow hallway in the basement level, through a crooked doorway that always stuck in the humidity.
It was one of those restrooms that always felt colder than the rest of the building, with tile floors that stayed slick even when it hadn't rained in days. The last stall on the right was always closed, locked from the inside. Zoe had tried knocking once, early on, thinking someone might have passed out inside. No response. When she looked under the door, it was dark, completely black, like the stall had no floor. That night in October, it had been drizzling for hours, and the bar was almost empty. Zoe went to check on supplies and stopped by the restroom. As she walked past the stalls, she heard it. A soft, steady weeping. Not loud, not forced. Just the quiet cry of someone who had run out of strength, but not tears. She paused, waited, called out. No answer. When she leaned toward the locked stall, the sound stopped. Not faded, stopped. As if it had never been there. She didn't tell anyone. A week later, the crying returned. Same time, close to midnight, same stall. Zoe didn't go inside. Instead, she stood in the hallway, her phone held low, recording. When she played it back later that night, there was no crying, just static. Then, at the very end, a whisper so faint she nearly missed it. "He locked me here." The words weren't hers. The voice wasn't hers. Zoe listened 10 times, heart pounding harder each time. The next day, she played it for no one. On a cold Thursday, a woman came into the bar right before closing. Mid-30s, raincoat clinging to her like a second skin, eyes scanning the room as if remembering something that used to be there. She ordered water, sat silently. And just as Zoe was wiping down the counter, the woman said, "You're the new bartender." It wasn't a question. Zoe nodded cautiously. The woman continued, "Do you hear her too?" That was when she introduced herself. Heather. She had worked here years ago, only for 6 months. Quit without notice. Zoe asked why. Heather answered without looking up, because she started answering me. Heather stood to leave, but paused near the door. "If you hear crying, don't knock again. Don't speak." She's not crying for help. She's remembering. That night, Zoe dreamed of a mirror, a long one, hanging over a sink in a room too dark to see clearly. Behind her reflection, a stall door swung open slowly, revealing only darkness. The next evening, she asked the manager if anything strange had happened at the bar before. He shrugged. Said old buildings make old noises. Said the last renovation was over a decade ago. When she pressed, he mentioned a girl who went missing years back. A patron. Quiet. Came in often, then stopped. No one noticed for a while. There were rumors she'd run off. Others said she'd never left the building. Zoe asked his name. "Sabrina," he said, then shook his head. But that was never confirmed. Zoe returned to the restroom after closing. Alone. The tile felt colder. The mirror was fogged, though she hadn't touched the sink. She crouched and looked under the locked stall. This time, there was something there. A sliver of silver metal, wedged between the tile and the stall wall. She reached for it. It was a locket, worn, dull. On the back, S. She opened it. No picture inside. Just a single strand of dark hair, curled and pressed flat like it had been there a long time. That night, the crying started earlier. It rose and fell like breath, curling around the corners of the room. Zoe stood outside the door, gripping the locket, listening. And then, just once, the crying stopped and turned into laughter. Dry, broken, familiar. The kind of sound you don't forget once it reaches you. Some people say buildings don't remember, but Zoe didn't agree. She had lived in enough foster homes, enough institutional corridors to know that walls keep things. Regret, silence, pain. The bar wasn't haunted, it was holding on. The next time it rained, the crying didn't come. The stall remained locked, but as Zoe wiped the mirror, she caught a glimpse, not of herself, but of someone standing where she wasn't. Pale, still, watching. When she turned around, no one was there, just the faint sound of dripping water, and something scratched faintly into the mirror's edge. "I'm still here," She never told the staff, never showed them the locket, but she started leaving the stall door open every night after close, just in case someone needed a way out. We like to think some stories end, especially the ones we don't want to carry. But some stories linger, not to haunt, but to be heard. And some voices cry, not for rescue, but remembrance. If you've ever felt something behind you in a quiet restroom, if you've ever heard a sound and told yourself it was nothing, maybe now you know. Some echoes aren't looking to scare you. They're asking not to be forgotten. And if you're still with me, still listening, then you understand why these stories matter. Follow us, not to chase shadows, but to remember what silence sometimes hides. Bars echo at night, but schools echo for generations. In San Francisco, beneath a school built to last, there are paths that no longer appear on any map, but names do. Over and over again, some students graduate, others vanish, and when no one remembers them, the walls do it for us. Story 7, Mission High, still remembers who disappeared underground. The rain had already soaked through Adam's hoodie by the time the last car pulled out of the Mission High parking lot. The graduation ceremony was over, the balloons popped, the selfies taken, the laughter swallowed by fog. But Adam wasn't ready to leave. He lingered near the back gym entrance, fiddling with his camera, pretending to adjust settings. He had recorded everything that night. The speeches, the music, even the last chaotic group hug on the auditorium steps. But something still felt unfinished, like a sentence cut short. Mission High had always carried a quiet weight. The building itself was old, older than most in San Francisco's Mission District, with stucco walls that trapped whispers and hallways that echoed louder than they should. Adam had spent 4 years walking those corridors, always looking down, always watching through the lens of his camera. He documented everything: morning announcements, locker pranks, forgotten lunchboxes. But beneath all of it was a sense that the school held stories it hadn't yet told. It was Luis who suggested the tunnel. After the graduation party ended, a small group stayed behind. 5 of them, still wearing gowns, sneakers soaked. The rain made the empty school shimmer, fluorescent lights flickering in the main hallway. Someone said, "Truth or dare." Someone else laughed, and before Adam could think of a way out, he was dared to take his camera down to the basement. The old storage tunnels under the east wing that had been sealed off for years. Supposedly. He didn't want to go, but saying no felt like sealing himself out of one last memory. So he went. The entrance was behind the custodial wing, beneath a rusted metal grate half hidden by overgrown ivy. Someone had clearly been down there before. The padlock was broken, the door slightly ajar. The others stayed behind, laughing and daring each other to go next, their voices fading as Adam descended. The air was heavy, moist, the kind that settles into your clothes and under your skin. He turned on his camera light. The walls were concrete, stained with time and rust. Pipes ran along the ceiling like veins. As he moved deeper, the light bounced oddly, like it was being absorbed. There were no signs of storage, no equipment, just a corridor that curved slightly left, then opened into a wider chamber. The graffiti began there. Names, dozens of them. Some fresh, others barely legible. But what caught his eye were the repetitions. One name again and again, Lucian Reyes, written in pencil, marker, even scratched into the concrete. A date followed some of them, 1988. Adam raised his camera. As he recorded, a soft static filled the audio. He checked the screen. The footage shimmered, bent slightly, like something underwater. He wiped the lens. The distortion remained. Then the sound came. Not a voice, not footsteps. A dragging noise, slow and deliberate, echoing just beyond the curve of the wall. He held still, breath locked in his chest. The dragging stopped. The camera light flickered. He turned around, ready to leave, and realized he wasn't alone. Luis was gone. Adam hadn't even heard him follow. He shouted once, no answer, only the sound of water dripping steadily from a pipe above. He retraced his steps, climbing back up to the surface where the others stood pale and confused. Luis wasn't with them. He had said he would go after Adam. No one had seen him come back. The school was searched, doors unlocked, announcements made, nothing. Luis's parents filed a report. The security footage showed him entering the building after the ceremony, but never leaving. Police found nothing in the tunnel except graffiti and a single sneaker, soaked through with mud. The school locked the entrance the next day. Adam stayed quiet at first, but something gnawed at him. The video file from that night was missing. Every clip he had shot at the tunnel was gone, deleted. No error message, no trace in recovery, just gone. Except for one still frame left behind in a backup folder. A frieze of a concrete wall covered in writing, and a single figure standing at the edge of the frame. Too dark to identify, too tall to be Luis. 2 weeks later, he returned to the school to find Ms. Alvarez. She'd been a custodian there for 40 years before retiring the year prior. Adam remembered her as the woman who always smiled at the lonely kids. He found her sitting outside a cafe on 24th Street, sipping something warm. When he mentioned the tunnel, her face tightened. She told him there had always been rumors, even when she started. Students who wandered too far, voices in the steam tunnels. She pulled something from her purse, a folded sheet of old blueprint paper. "This is the original layout," she said. "Back when the school was built after the 1906 quake. There's a section in the Lower East Wing labeled Lucian's Path. It was removed from the newer plans." Adam unfolded the paper later that night. There it was, Lucian's Path, sketched like a forgotten vein beneath the school. A narrow tunnel leading nowhere, or maybe to somewhere never meant to be found. He stopped filming after that. The camera stayed in his closet, gathering dust. He still heard Luis's name whispered sometimes, mostly by those who had been there that night, but no one mentioned the tunnel again. And slowly, Luis faded. His locker was reassigned, his photo removed from the yearbook. Like he'd never been there, but Adam remembered. Not everything disappears. Some things simply slip sideways into places we don't see. And sometimes schools remember better than students. They carry things, names, mistakes, loss, especially when no one's left to speak them aloud. If you ever find yourself in an old hallway that suddenly goes quiet, where the air feels too still and the shadows too long, listen. Not for ghosts, but for the stories walls whisper when no one else is around. Because forgetting someone doesn't mean they're gone. And if this story made you remember someone you haven't thought about in a long time, maybe someone who didn't get their goodbye, then you know why we share stories like this. Not for fear, but for memory. And if you're still listening, still here with us beyond the veil, stay close. Some names are written where only the brave will look. Some tunnels lead nowhere. Some roads do the same. Missouri is a place where trees grow too close and GPS signals bend just slightly wrong. And if you've ever driven alone during a storm, you know this already. There are roads that exist only when it rains, and some passengers never left them. Story 8. The GPS led me to a woman who was already dead. The highway was slick with rain, the kind that doesn't just fall, it clings. Travis had been on the road for 12 hours straight, cutting through the Missouri Ozarks in the thick dark of early spring. He knew this route like the lines on his weathered hands. Interstate 44, exit 169, then another 2 hours to Springfield. But somewhere near Devil's Elbow, the GPS chirped with a recalculation, offering a shortcut. A softer voice than usual said, "Take the next right." It didn't feel right, but exhaustion has a way of making decisions for you. The turnoff looked old, barely paved, swallowed on both sides by trees that leaned too close. No signs, no markers, just asphalt and wet leaves. Travis slowed down, blinked twice, and figured he'd backtrack if it didn't reconnect. The rain thickened, hammering the windshield in sheets. He turned on the high beams and gripped the wheel tighter. That's when he saw her. A woman standing in the middle of the road, soaked, barefoot, in what looked like a hospital gown. She didn't wave, she didn't run. She simply stood still, her arm outstretched, pointing to the woods on the right. Travis slammed the brakes, tires skidding. When the truck finally stopped, she was gone. He sat there, heart pounding harder than he'd admit. The road ahead disappeared into black. Behind him, no lights, no cars, just rain and the silence that follows a shock. He opened the door, stepped into the downpour, and called out. Nothing. Just wind threading through branches and the faint creak of his trailer settling. He checked the dash cam, but the footage was blank. Just a flicker of static where she should have been. He turned the truck around and returned to the main road. At the nearest gas station in Rolla, he sat in the corner booth with a coffee that tasted like metal and tried to make sense of it. That's when Deputy Holloway slid into the seat across from him. Gray hair, rain-slick jacket, badge that had seen better decades. "You're not the first," he said, without introduction. "And you won't be the last." Holloway pulled out a small file folder, thick with handwritten notes. All from drivers like Travis, all from the same stretch of road. They say she shows up when the rain's just right. Always points, never speaks. Some follow. They don't come back. Travis asked why it wasn't on the news. Holloway looked out the window, then back. Because it's easier to call them accidents. Back in the motel room that night, Travis couldn't shake the feeling. He had seen wrecks before. Years of hauling freight coast to coast, he'd passed his share of overturned semis and white-sheeted silhouettes. But nothing had ever felt like this. There was no scream, no impact, no death, just a presence that stayed long after the road disappeared. The next night, against his better judgment, he drove back. Not because he was brave, not because he believed in ghosts, but because something about that encounter felt incomplete. The shortcut appeared again. Same GPS voice, same instruction. He followed it. This time he brought a flashlight. When the woman appeared, she was closer. Same gown, same outstretched arm, but her face was visible now. Pale, calm, almost pleading. Travis stopped the truck, stepped out, and instead of calling to her, he followed where she pointed, into the woods. The trees swallowed sound. His boots sank into wet moss. After about 50 yards, the forest opened into a clearing. At the center was an old car, crushed against a tree, vines growing through the windshield. The metal had rusted to the color of dried blood. Inside, barely visible beneath shattered glass and leaves, was a body, long gone. Nothing left but a sunken skull and a hospital ID badge faded beyond recognition. Travis turned back, breath shallow. The woman was gone. He reported it. Holloway returned. The plate traced back to a missing person from 2006, Marla Deeks, patient at a facility in Lebanon, disappeared during a transfer. Her file had been closed. Presumed runaway. No one had ever looked past the first 2 miles of forest. "Why me?" Travis asked. Holloway lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "Maybe because you stopped." The next time it rained, Travis drove through Devil's Elbow again. He looked. She never returned. But sometimes when the wipers squeak just so, and the trees lean in too close, he wonders if she's still out there, waiting for the next driver willing to follow a silent plea. We think we're in control behind the wheel, but the road has its own memory. And some paths, once taken, leave something behind. Not everyone on the road is lost. Some are waiting to be found. Others just want company for the last stretch. If you've ever seen something on a night drive and told yourself it was nothing, maybe it was. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe you were being asked to witness something no one else would. And if this story makes you glance twice the next time the rain blurs your windshield, then you understand why we tell these stories. Not to frighten, but to remind that not all lost souls are trying to leave. Some are trying to come home. And if you're still here with us, still listening, then maybe this road brought you to the right place. You know what to do next. 8 storms, 8 names that weren't supposed to be remembered, but rain has a way of keeping score. And now that you've seen where it leads, into motels, beneath gas stations, behind mirrors, under schools, and onto roads that don't return, you may understand what most people miss. The veil isn't broken in lightning. It's softened by rain. If you've made it this far, it means something in these stories stayed with you. Not just the fear, not just the images, but something quieter. A feeling you couldn't shake. Maybe it was the silence in the basement, or the sound of footsteps that should have been yours alone. Maybe it was the way a stranger in the rain didn't look away. Or how a single name, written 100 times on a wall, made you pause. What binds these stories together isn't just the rain. It's the fact that each moment, no matter how small, was real to someone. These aren't just events, they're echoes. Lingering imprints of lives that touch something beyond explanation, and were changed by it, subtly, permanently. That's the truth no one really tells you. The scariest part isn't what happened, it's what remained afterward. A glance over the shoulder, an empty room that never feels empty again. A sound you now notice every time it rains. Most people will tell you to forget, to move on. But the people in these stories couldn't. And maybe you can't either. That's why you're here. Not to be entertained, but to feel less alone in the not knowing, the not sleeping, the not sure if it was real. If any of this reminded you of something you've never spoken aloud, something that still pulls at the edge of your memory, then maybe it's time, not to explain it, but to name it, and let it be real for someone else, too. We'll be here, still listening, beyond the surface, beyond the noise, beyond the veil, and when it rains again, because it always does, you'll know what to listen for.